Dr. Robert Mackenzie's weathered hand froze mid-reach for his coffee cup as the massive lion stepped through the funeral parlor doors. 400 mourners fell silent as one, their collective breath caught in a moment that defied every natural law they knew. Marcus wasn't supposed to be here. Eleanor Patterson's prayer book slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the cathedral-like silence. Tommy Mackenzie bolted upright from the front pew, his psychiatrist's training warring with disbelief as he watched his father's 8-year-old lion companion approach the mahogany casket with deliberate, almost reverent steps. The golden beast had somehow traveled 12 miles through Montana wilderness to find this place, to find the man who had given him everything. "Dear God," whispered Reverend Matthews, backing toward the altar as Marcus placed one massive paw on the polished wood, his amber eyes never leaving the still face visible through the glass. What kind of love could drive a wild animal to seek out death itself? And what had Dr. Mackenzie done to earn such impossible devotion? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, the North American Lion Sanctuary in the heart of Montana's Glacier County had been Dr. Robert Mackenzie's last chance at redemption. At 67, the Vietnam veteran turned veterinarian carried more ghosts than most men twice his age could bear. His wife, Helen, had been gone 4 years, cancer taking her as surely as the war had taken pieces of his soul. His eldest son, David, had died in a senseless car accident, and Tommy, his surviving boy, hadn't spoken to him in over 2 years. The sanctuary sprawled across 800 acres of pristine wilderness, funded by an anonymous benefactor whose monthly checks kept the operation running despite Bob's complete lack of business sense. He lived alone in a modest cabin on the property, tending to 17 rescued big cats with the same gentle precision that had once saved wounded soldiers in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Eleanor Patterson, though Bob didn't know it then, watched him from her mansion overlooking the valley. At 72, the widow of Montana's cattle baron had more money than she knew what to do with, and a heart that ached with secrets she'd carried for 45 years. She'd been funding Bob's sanctuary since its inception, drawn to his quiet dedication and the way he spoke to damaged animals as if they were old friends worth saving. 12 miles east, Victoria Sterling ran her real estate empire from a glass office in Billings, her sharp suits and sharper tongue hiding a woman who'd spent her entire life searching for something she couldn't name. At 45, she was Montana's most successful developer, known for turning wilderness into profit with ruthless efficiency. What no one suspected was that she'd been systematically buying up land around the sanctuary, not to destroy it, but to protect it from developers like herself. And then there was Marcus. The 8-year-old African lion had arrived at the sanctuary broken in ways that went beyond the physical scars crisscrossing his golden coat. Rescued from a bankrupt circus in Nevada, Marcus bore the psychological wounds of years spent in cramped cages, beaten into submission for the entertainment of crowds who never saw past his magnificent exterior to the terror in his amber eyes. Most lions would have taken months to trust again. Marcus was different. From the moment Bob approached his enclosure, speaking in the same low, reassuring tone he'd used with dying soldiers, something passed between man and beast that defied scientific explanation. Within weeks, Marcus was following Bob like an enormous, lethal shadow. The lion refused meals unless Bob fed him personally, slept only when he could see the old veterinarian's cabin, and displayed an uncanny ability to sense Bob's increasingly frequent heart episodes before they happened. The other sanctuary staff whispered about the unnaturally strong bond between the aging doctor and his dangerous patient. They didn't understand that both man and beast were survivors of different wars, finding in each other the peace that had eluded them for so long. Neither Bob nor Marcus knew that their quiet sanctuary was about to become the center of a storm that would test everything they believed about love, loyalty, and the invisible threads that bind damaged souls together. The first steel trap appeared on a Tuesday morning in late February, its jagged teeth glinting with malicious intent beneath a thin dusting of Montana snow. Bob discovered it during his routine perimeter check, hidden among the pine needles just 50 yards from Marcus's favorite resting spot. His weathered hands shook as he carefully disarmed the device, noting the fresh scratches on the metal that suggested recent placement. "Someone's been busy," he muttered to himself, tucking the trap into his supply bag. This wasn't the work of casual poachers. The placement was too strategic, too close to the sanctuary's main enclosures. Someone wanted to hurt his animals specifically. Over the next 3 days, Bob found 6 more traps scattered throughout the property. Each discovery sent his blood pressure spiking higher, his cardiologist's warnings about stress echoing in his mind like an unwelcome mantra. He'd been living on borrowed time since his last heart attack 18 months ago, and everyone except Marcus seemed determined to remind him of his mortality. The anonymous letters had been arriving every Friday for the past month, always in the same neat handwriting, always containing the same cryptic message: "He remembers you." Bob kept them in his kitchen drawer, reading them during his solitary dinners, and wondering if someone was playing an elaborate prank. The postmark was local, but that narrowed things down to about 3,000 people in Glacier County. Marcus had been acting strangely, too. The massive lion, normally content to patrol his territory with lazy confidence, now refused to venture more than 20 feet from Bob's side. During their afternoon walks, Marcus would suddenly stop and stare at empty patches of forest, his ears flattened against his skull in a way that made Bob's veteran instincts scream warnings. "What is it, boy?" Bob would ask, following the lion's gaze into the shadows between the trees. But Marcus would only press closer to his keeper, a low rumble vibrating in his chest that sounded more worried than threatening. The weather reports weren't helping Bob's anxiety. A massive storm system was barreling down from Canada, promising to dump 3 feet of snow on the sanctuary by week's end. In his current state of health, Bob knew he wouldn't be able to handle the physical demands of caring for 17 big cats through a major blizzard. He'd need help, but the nearest volunteer lived 40 miles away, and his pride wouldn't let him ask. On Thursday afternoon, his phone rang with the distinctive chime he'd assigned to his son Tommy's number. Bob stared at the device for 3 rings before answering, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Dad?" Tommy's voice carried across 2,000 miles of distance and years of accumulated hurt. "I've been thinking about you." "About us." "Tommy." Bob closed his eyes, gripping the phone like a lifeline. "It's good to hear your voice, son. Listen, I know this is out of the blue, but I've been having these dreams about David, about you and that lion of yours. I think I need to come home." Before Bob could respond, Marcus appeared at his elbow, pressing his massive head against Bob's leg with unusual urgency. The lion's amber eyes were fixed on something beyond the cabin windows, his entire body tense with anticipation. "Dad? You still there?" "Yeah, I'm here." Bob's free hand found the thick fur of Marcus's mane, drawing comfort from the familiar texture. "When were you thinking of visiting?" "I'm already on the road. Should be there by Saturday morning if the weather holds." Bob's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't quite name. His son was coming home after 2 years of silence, just as the biggest storm in a decade was preparing to test every survival skill Bob had learned in 7 decades of hard living. That evening, as he made his final rounds before the storm hit, Bob discovered the 8th trap. This one was different. Larger, crueler, positioned directly across the path Marcus used to reach the main water source. Someone wasn't just trying to hurt random animals anymore. Someone was specifically targeting his lion. Bob disarmed the trap with shaking fingers, his heart pounding erratically as the implications sank in. Marcus stood guard beside him, occasionally glancing toward the darkening sky where the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. "We're in for a hell of a weekend, aren't we, boy?" Bob whispered, scratching behind Marcus's ears. The lion responded with a low chuff that might have been agreement, or might have been a warning. As they walked back toward the warmth of the cabin, neither man nor beast noticed the figure watching them from the tree line or the sound of a car engine starting up in the distance. The storm was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would test every bond of loyalty Bob had ever known. The blizzard hit Montana with the fury of an angry god, transforming Bob's sanctuary into a white wilderness where visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind howled like banshees through the pine trees. By Friday evening, 3 feet of snow had already accumulated, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. Bob stood at his cabin window, watching Marcus pace restlessly in the outdoor section of his enclosure, the lion's golden coat dusted with snowflakes that melted instantly against his warm body. Something was wrong. Bob had lived with Marcus long enough to read the subtle signs of the lion's distress, the way his tail twitched with nervous energy, how his ears swiveled constantly toward the eastern boundary of the property, the low growls that rumbled from his chest every few minutes. It wasn't the storm that had Marcus agitated. Lions were remarkably adaptable to cold weather, and Marcus had weathered Montana winters before. Bob's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from his nearest neighbor, Jim Hartwell, who lived 5 miles down the mountain road. The text was brief but alarming. "Saw lights moving around your east fence line around midnight. Poachers, maybe. Can't get through in this weather to check. Be careful." Bob's blood ran cold. Poachers were bad enough under normal circumstances, but during a blizzard, when escape routes were limited and help was hours away, they became exponentially more dangerous. He pulled on his heaviest winter gear and grabbed his rifle, though he prayed he wouldn't need to use it. The trek to the eastern boundary took 40 minutes through knee-deep snow, his flashlight beam barely penetrating the swirling white curtain that surrounded him. His heart hammered against his ribs with each labored step, and he had to stop twice to catch his breath and let the crushing pain in his chest subside. The cardiologist's words echoed in his mind. "Any significant physical stress could trigger another attack, Robert. You need to be realistic about your limitations." But Marcus needed him. That was all that mattered. Bob found the first sign of intrusion near the old oak tree that marked the sanctuary's northeast corner. Fresh tire tracks were rapidly filling with snow, but the deep impressions suggested a heavy vehicle had been here recently. Scattered around the tracks were several more of the steel traps, these ones larger and more vicious than anything Bob had encountered before. As he knelt to examine the closest trap, a sound that made his blood freeze reached his ears through the howling wind, Marcus roaring in distress. Not the territorial bellow Bob was accustomed to, but a cry of pain and fear that cut through the storm like a knife. Bob ran toward the sound, his aging body protesting every step as he crashed through snowdrifts and low-hanging branches. His chest felt like someone was squeezing it in a vise, and his vision blurred at the edges, but he pressed forward. Behind him, his footprints were already disappearing under the relentless snowfall. He found Marcus 30 yards into the woods, caught in the largest steel trap Bob had ever seen. The device had clamped around the lion's right rear leg, just above the paw, and every movement Marcus made caused the serrated teeth to bite deeper into his flesh. Blood stained the snow in a widening circle around the trapped animal. "Easy, boy. Easy now." Bob approached slowly, hands extended, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his throat. Marcus's amber eyes locked onto his keeper's face, and the lion's struggles ceased immediately. The trust in that gaze was absolute and heartbreaking. Bob pulled out his satellite phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers, leaving them completely isolated. He looked at Marcus, then at the trap, doing quick calculations in his head. The nearest veterinarian was in Kalispell, over an hour away under good conditions. In this weather, it would take emergency responders at least 3 hours to reach them, if they could reach them at all. Marcus would bleed to death long before help arrived. Bob knelt in the bloody snow beside his companion, examining the trap's mechanism with the methodical precision of a man who had disarmed explosive devices in Vietnam. This particular model was designed to prevent escape. The more the victim struggled, the tighter it clamped. Releasing it would require removing a series of safety pins while simultaneously applying pressure to the release lever. The problem was positioning. To free Marcus, Bob would need to lie flat on his stomach in the snow, reaching under the lion's powerful body to access the trap's release mechanism. One wrong move, one moment of panic from Marcus, and those massive jaws could crush Bob's skull in an instant. "What do you think, old friend?" Bob whispered, placing his gloved hand on Marcus's massive head. "Trust me one more time?" Marcus responded with a low chuff that sounded almost like agreement, then lowered his great head to rest it against Bob's shoulder. The gesture was so human, so full of faith and resignation that Bob felt tears freezing on his cheeks. As Bob positioned himself beside the trap, his heart began to race erratically. The familiar crushing sensation in his chest warned him that his body was approaching its limits. He had maybe 20 minutes before the stress triggered another cardiac episode, and this time there would be no ambulance rushing to save him. 20 minutes to save the life of the only creature left on Earth who loved him unconditionally. Bob began working on the first safety pin, his numb fingers struggling with the mechanism as Marcus lay perfectly still in the snow, trusting his keeper completely, even as his life ebbed away, drop by crimson drop. Bob's fingers, numb with cold despite his heavy gloves, worked methodically on the first safety pin, while Marcus lay motionless in the blood-stained snow. The lion's breathing had grown shallow, each exhale creating small puffs of steam that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Bob could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs with dangerous irregularity, but he forced himself to focus on the delicate mechanism beneath his hands. As he struggled with the stubborn metal, memories began flooding back with startling clarity. The year was 1971, and he was 24 years old, crouched in a rice paddy outside Da Nang, trying to disarm a booby trap while mortar rounds exploded in the distance. His hands had been steadier then, his heart stronger. But the same methodical precision that had saved his squad that day now guided his movements as he fought to save Marcus. "Stay with me, boy," Bob whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I've got you." The first pin came free with a metallic click that seemed impossibly loud in the muffled silence of the storm. Bob moved to the second pin, his vision blurring at the edges as his blood pressure spiked. He paused to catch his breath, pressing his forehead against Marcus's warm flank. The lion's story came back to him then, as vivid as if it were happening again. 3 years ago, Marcus had arrived at the sanctuary in the back of a livestock trailer, his magnificent coat dull with malnutrition and his spirit broken by years of abuse. The circus that had owned him for 6 years had finally gone bankrupt, their animals seized by authorities and distributed to various rescue facilities across the western states. Bob remembered their first meeting with crystalline clarity. Marcus had cowered in the corner of his temporary holding pen, his amber eyes reflecting not the proud majesty of the king of beasts, but the hollow despair of a creature that had forgotten what kindness looked like. The circus handlers had beaten him into submission with electric prods and steel pipes, teaching him that humans meant pain and that resistance only brought more suffering. Most lions in Marcus's condition would have required months of careful rehabilitation before allowing human contact. But something about Bob's quiet presence, his patient movements and gentle voice, had reached through the layers of trauma to touch whatever spark of trust still flickered in Marcus's damaged soul. The breakthrough had come on Bob's 7th visit to Marcus's enclosure. Bob had been sitting quietly on a log just outside the fence, reading aloud from an old Louis L'Amour novel, a habit he'd developed with traumatized animals, believing that the sound of a calm human voice could begin to heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. Suddenly, Marcus had approached the fence and, for the first time since his arrival, made direct eye contact with a human being. "You've seen some things, haven't you, boy?" Bob had whispered that day, reaching slowly through the chain link to let Marcus smell his hand. "Me too. But we're safe now. Both of us." The second safety pin released, snapping Bob back to the present. His chest felt like someone was standing on it, and he had to fight waves of nausea as his body protested the stress he was putting it under. But Marcus's breathing was becoming more labored, and Bob could see that the blood loss was taking its toll. The third pin was corroded with rust and proved more stubborn than the first two. Bob's frozen fingers slipped twice, and he had to bite back a curse as precious seconds ticked away. As he worked, another memory surfaced, this one more recent and infinitely more painful. It was 18 months ago, the night Helen had died. Bob had been keeping vigil at her hospital bedside for 3 days, watching cancer slowly steal away the woman who had been his anchor for 38 years. Helen had been unconscious for hours, her breathing so shallow that several times Bob had thought she was already gone. Then, near dawn, she had opened her eyes one final time and focused on his face with startling clarity. "Promise me something, Bobby," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't you dare give up when I'm gone. You've got too much love left to give." Bob had promised, though at the time he couldn't imagine how he would keep that vow. The world without Helen had seemed impossibly empty, a vast wasteland where nothing would ever matter again. It wasn't until Marcus came into his life that Bob understood what Helen had meant. Love wasn't a finite resource that died with its object. It was something that could be shared, transferred, given freely to any creature brave enough to accept it. The third pin finally released, and Bob moved to the most critical part of the operation, the main release lever. This required him to reach completely under Marcus's body while simultaneously applying pressure to 2 separate mechanisms. One mistake, one moment of panic from the injured lion, and Bob's arm could be crushed. "I need you to trust me completely now," Bob said, positioning himself flat on his stomach in the snow. The cold immediately began seeping through his heavy jacket, and he could feel ice crystals forming in his beard. "Just like that day you first let me touch you." Marcus seemed to understand. The great lion lifted his head and positioned it so that Bob could slide his arm underneath the powerful body. Bob felt the lion's muscles tense and relax as Marcus fought his own instincts to protect himself from potential threat. As Bob worked on the final mechanism, his thoughts turned to his son Tommy, somewhere on the road between New York and Montana, driving through the same storm that was turning Bob's rescue mission into a potential death sentence. Tommy, who hadn't spoken to his father in 2 years because Bob had been too proud to admit that he needed help, too stubborn to ask for forgiveness. The rift between them had started at David's funeral. Tommy, in his grief, had accused Bob of caring more about wounded animals than his own family. "You save every broken thing you find except the people who actually matter," Tommy had shouted, his psychiatrist's composure finally cracking under the weight of losing his older brother. "When was the last time you asked how I was doing?" "Really asked?" Bob had been too raw with his own grief to hear the pain underneath Tommy's anger. Instead of reaching out to his surviving son, he had retreated further into his work, using the sanctuary as a shield against emotions he didn't know how to process. It wasn't until Marcus came along that Bob began to understand that healing broken things was indeed his calling. He had just been too blind to see that his own son was one of the broken things that needed fixing. The release lever moved a fraction of an inch, then stopped. Bob adjusted his position, ignoring the shooting pains in his chest as he strained to reach the secondary mechanism. His vision was starting to tunnel, and he knew he was running out of time. If he lost consciousness now, both he and Marcus would die in this frozen wasteland. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on, you piece of—" The trap released with a sharp metallic snap, its jaws springing open to free Marcus's mangled leg. The lion immediately tried to stand, then collapsed back into the snow with a grunt of pain. The injury was bad. Bob could see exposed bone and torn tendons, but it wasn't immediately life-threatening if they could get Marcus back to the sanctuary's medical facility. Bob rolled away from the trap, gasping for breath as his heart hammered against his ribs with increasingly erratic rhythm. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision, and he could taste copper in his mouth. He was having another heart attack, he realized with oddly detached clarity. Right here, right now, with no help for miles and a badly injured lion depending on him for survival. "Not yet," he whispered to whatever force controlled such things. "Let me get him home first." Marcus seemed to sense Bob's distress. Despite his own injury, the lion struggled to his feet and moved close to Bob's side, pressing his warm body against the old man's back. The gesture was purely protective, offering what comfort a wild animal could provide to the human who had just risked everything to save him. Bob forced himself to sit up, using Marcus's solid presence as support. The sanctuary was still half a mile away through deep snow, and he wasn't sure either of them had the strength to make the journey. But lying here wasn't an option. The storm was getting worse, and their body heat wouldn't last long against Montana's winter fury. "What do you say, partner?" Bob asked, scratching behind Marcus's ears with trembling fingers. "One more adventure." The journey back to the sanctuary became a nightmare of endurance that tested every survival skill Bob had learned in 7 decades of hard living. Marcus, despite his injured leg, refused to let Bob struggle alone through the deepening snow. The lion positioned himself alongside the failing man, offering his powerful body as support whenever Bob stumbled or his heart stuttered with dangerous irregularity. Each step felt like walking through molasses. The wind had picked up to near hurricane force, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and reducing visibility to mere feet. Bob's chest felt like someone was crushing it in a vise, and more than once he had to stop and lean heavily against Marcus's warm flank, while waves of nausea and dizziness threatened to drop him face first into the snow. "Keep talking, Bobby," he muttered to himself, remembering the advice his army medic had given him during a similar crisis in Vietnam. "Stay conscious. Stay focused." But his voice was growing weaker, and the words came out in ragged gasps that were immediately swallowed by the howling wind. Marcus seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. Every few minutes the lion would stop and look back at Bob with those intelligent amber eyes, as if checking to make sure his human companion was still conscious. When Bob's steps became too unsteady, Marcus would move closer, allowing the old veterinarian to grip the thick fur of his mane for support. Halfway back to the sanctuary, Bob's legs finally gave out. He collapsed into a snowdrift, his heart hammering so erratically that he couldn't catch his breath. This was it, he realized with strange calm. This was how he was going to die. Not in a hospital bed surrounded by family, but in the middle of a Montana blizzard, trying to save the one creature on Earth who loved him unconditionally. "I'm sorry, boy," he gasped, reaching out to touch Marcus's massive head. "I'm so sorry." But Marcus wasn't ready to give up. The lion positioned himself next to Bob's prone form and began making a sound Bob had never heard before, a deep, rhythmic vocalization that seemed almost like singing. It wasn't a roar or a growl, but something hauntingly melodic that carried across the wind like a prayer. Within minutes, answering calls began echoing through the storm. The other lions at the sanctuary had heard Marcus's distress song and were responding with their own voices. Even through the blizzard, Bob could make out the distinctive roars of Duchess, the elderly lioness in the north enclosure, and Thunder, the young male who had arrived just 6 months ago. The sound seemed to give Marcus new determination. He moved behind Bob and, with surprising gentleness for such a massive predator, began nudging the man forward with his enormous head. When Bob tried to protest that he couldn't go any further, Marcus simply lay down beside him and used his own body heat to warm the hypothermic veterinarian. "You're not giving up on me, are you?" Bob whispered, amazed by the lion's refusal to abandon him. "Just like I didn't give up on you." They stayed that way for several minutes, man and beast sharing warmth while the storm raged around them. Bob's heart gradually settled into a less erratic rhythm, though he knew he was still in serious danger. The crushing pain in his chest hadn't lessened, and his vision continued to blur at the edges. Finally, Marcus rose and began the nudging process again, this time with more insistence. Bob understood. They couldn't stay here. The cold would kill them both if they didn't keep moving. With Marcus's help, he struggled back to his feet, and they resumed their desperate trek toward safety. The sanctuary's lights finally appeared through the swirling snow like beacons of salvation. Bob had never been so grateful to see the simple buildings where he'd spent the last 3 years of his life. But even as relief flooded through him, he realized their troubles were far from over. Marcus needed immediate medical attention, and Bob's own condition was deteriorating rapidly. Getting Marcus into the medical facility proved to be another challenge entirely. The lion's injured leg couldn't support his full weight, and Bob lacked the strength to provide much assistance. Twice, Marcus collapsed in the snow just yards from the door, and Bob thought they might both freeze to death within sight of salvation. It was then that Bob heard the sound of an engine cutting through the storm. Headlights appeared at the sanctuary's main gate, growing brighter as a vehicle fought its way up the snow-covered drive. Bob's heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was Jim Hartwell, his neighbor, somehow managing to get through the storm to check on them. The vehicle pulled up near the medical building, and Bob watched in amazement as not one but 2 figures emerged from what he now recognized as a luxury SUV. The first was a woman in an expensive winter coat, moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge. The second figure made Bob's heart nearly stop altogether. "Dad!" Tommy's voice cut through the wind like a lifeline. "Dad, where are you?" "Here!" Bob called back, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Over here!" Tommy came running through the snow, followed closely by the woman Bob didn't recognize. When Tommy reached his father's side, Bob could see tears freezing on his son's face. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Tommy demanded, his psychiatrist's training warring with filial panic as he assessed both Bob's condition and the injured lion beside him. "Dad, you look terrible. Your lips are blue, and you're barely conscious." Marcus was trapped, Bob managed to explain between labored breaths. "Had to get him out." The woman introduced herself as Victoria Sterling, though the name meant nothing to Bob in his current state. What mattered was that she seemed to know what she was doing, immediately taking charge of the situation with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. "We need to get them both inside immediately," Victoria declared, pulling out her cell phone. "I'm calling for a medical helicopter, assuming any can fly in this weather." "The closest trauma center is in Kalispell," Tommy said, already moving to support his father's weight. "But I don't think anything's flying tonight." Together, the 3 of them managed to get Marcus into the medical facility, where Bob kept a full veterinary surgical suite. The lion collapsed onto the examination table, his breathing shallow but steady. Bob, despite his own condition, immediately began giving instructions for treating Marcus's injuries. "Ketamine in the locked cabinet," he told Tommy, pointing with shaking hands. "And get the suture kit from the autoclave. That leg needs immediate attention." "Dad, you need attention," Tommy protested. "You're having a cardiac episode. I can see it." "The lion first," Bob insisted with the stubborn determination that had driven him through Vietnam and 30 years of veterinary practice. Always the patient first. Victoria watched this exchange with growing amazement. Even in the midst of what was clearly a life-threatening medical emergency, Bob's first concern was for the animal he'd risked everything to save. She began to understand why her anonymous gifts to the sanctuary had been so well used. This man truly cared about every creature under his protection. As Tommy worked on Marcus's injuries under his father's expert guidance, Bob felt a strange sense of completion. His son was here, working beside him as they'd never done before. The lion he loved was going to survive, and for the first time in years, he felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. The crushing pain in his chest was getting worse, and Bob knew his time was running out. But as he watched Tommy's skilled hands working to save Marcus, he realized that maybe this was how it was supposed to end, not alone and forgotten, but surrounded by love and purpose. "I'm proud of you, son," Bob whispered, gripping Tommy's shoulder. "I should have told you that a long time ago." Tommy looked up from his work, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." But Bob could feel his heart beginning to flutter like a bird with a broken wing, and he knew that some promises were too big for any man to keep. The cardiac monitor's steady beeping suddenly became erratic, then transformed into the continuous soul-crushing wail of a flatline. Bob's body went rigid on the makeshift hospital bed Tommy had set up in the sanctuary's medical facility, his weathered face peaceful despite the chaos erupting around him. "No, no, no!" Tommy lunged for the defibrillator, his psychiatric training giving way to the desperate instincts of a son watching his father die. "Dad, stay with me." Victoria Sterling, who had been coordinating with emergency services on her satellite phone, dropped the device and rushed to help. Her hands shook as she began chest compressions, her expensive manicure forgotten as she fought to restart the heart of a man she barely knew but had secretly supported for 3 years. "Come on, Bob," she whispered, putting her full weight behind each compression. "Don't you dare leave us now." Tommy charged the defibrillator with trembling hands, the machine's high-pitched whine cutting through the storm's howling like a scream. "Clear!" he shouted, though Victoria had already stepped back. Bob's body arched with the electrical shock, then settled back onto the table with devastating stillness. The monitor remained flat. "Again!" Tommy's voice cracked with anguish that went far beyond medical professionalism. This wasn't a patient, this was his father, the man he'd spent 2 years punishing with silence instead of loving with words. They worked in desperate synchronization for 23 minutes. Chest compressions, electrical shocks, emergency medications from Bob's veterinary supplies. Nothing worked. Bob Mackenzie, Vietnam veteran, devoted veterinarian, and the gentlest man either of them had ever known, was gone. Marcus, despite his injuries and the sedatives Tommy had administered, somehow sensed the moment of Bob's passing. The great lion lifted his massive head from the examination table where he was recovering and released a sound that neither human had ever heard before, a low, mournful keen that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. It was the sound of a creature mourning its dearest friend, and it broke both Tommy and Victoria completely. Tommy collapsed into a chair beside his father's body, his face buried in his hands as 13 years of unspoken regret came pouring out in broken sobs. "I was supposed to tell him I loved him," he whispered. I drove 2,000 miles to tell him I loved him, and I was too late." Victoria stood frozen at the foot of Bob's bed, staring at the man who had unknowingly become her hero over the past 3 years. Through her anonymous donations, she had watched him transform broken animals into trusting companions, had read his monthly reports describing each small victory and heartbreaking setback. Now the sanctuary would close, the animals would be relocated, and the quiet magic Bob had created here would disappear forever. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself were mourning Bob's passing. Wind rattled the medical facility's windows while snow piled higher against the doors. The power flickered twice, casting eerie shadows across the scene of loss and leaving them dependent on the facility's backup generator. Marcus refused to be sedated further despite his injuries. Every time Tommy tried to approach with another syringe, the lion would fix him with those intelligent amber eyes and shake his great head with unmistakable refusal. Instead, Marcus positioned himself as close to Bob's body as his wounded leg would allow, maintaining a vigil that spoke to bonds deeper than species or language. "He knows," Victoria said quietly, watching the lion's behavior with amazement. "He actually understands what's happened." Tommy looked up from his grief to study Marcus more carefully. As a psychiatrist, he'd always been skeptical of claims about animal intelligence and emotional capacity. But there was no denying the profound sadness radiating from the great cat, the way Marcus kept placing his massive paw gently on Bob's still hand, as if trying to wake him. "Dad always said Marcus was different," Tommy murmured, reaching out tentatively to touch the lion's mane. To his surprise, Marcus didn't react with aggression. Instead, the lion pressed closer to Tommy, seeking comfort from the only piece of Bob that remained. He said Marcus understood things other animals couldn't. The hours passed in surreal suspension. The storm continued to rage, making any hope of emergency services reaching them impossible until morning. Tommy and Victoria took turns maintaining the generator that kept the medical facility's heating system running, while Marcus never left Bob's side. At some point during the long night, Victoria began talking. Maybe it was the shock or the strange intimacy of sharing grief with strangers, but she found herself confessing secrets she'd never told another living soul. "I've been funding this place for 3 years," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Bob never knew it was me. I started because I thought it would be a good tax write-off, but then I got his first report. He wrote about each animal like they were his children. 7 pages about a rescued tiger named Sabrina who had been abused by her owners, and how patient he was with her, how he sat outside her cage for hours just talking to her until she trusted him enough to let him treat an infected wound." Tommy looked at her with new understanding. "You're the anonymous donor." "The one who kept this place running?" Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant to get emotionally involved. I just kept reading his reports, watching him save these broken animals. And I realized he was doing something beautiful here, something pure. And now it's over." "Maybe it doesn't have to be," Tommy said quietly, though he wasn't sure he believed his own words. As dawn approached, the storm finally began to weaken. Emergency services would be able to reach them within hours, but the damage was already done. Bob was gone. Marcus was traumatized beyond anything Tommy felt qualified to treat, and the sanctuary faced an uncertain future. Marcus had remained awake all night, his amber eyes never leaving Bob's face. As the first pale light of morning filtered through the snow-covered windows, the lion did something that made both humans gasp in amazement. Marcus carefully lifted his injured paw and placed it over Bob's heart, pressing gently as if checking for a pulse he would never find again. Then, with movements so gentle they seemed impossible for such a massive predator, Marcus laid his great head on Bob's chest and closed his eyes. "He's saying goodbye," Victoria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Tommy felt his own tears starting fresh. In his years as a psychiatrist, he'd counseled hundreds of people through grief, but he'd never witnessed anything as purely heartbreaking as this lion's final farewell to the man who had saved him. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance announced the arrival of the medical team that had come too late. Soon, strangers would take Bob's body away, and this moment of perfect, devastating love would be just a memory. But Marcus wasn't finished. As the helicopter landed outside, the great lion lifted his head one final time and released a roar that shook the walls of the medical facility. It wasn't a cry of anger or territorial dominance, it was pure grief, raw and primal and utterly human in its anguish. The king of beasts was mourning his friend, and the sound would haunt Tommy Mackenzie for the rest of his life. 3 days after Bob's death, as funeral arrangements consumed the small Montana community, Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the sanctuary with a manila folder that would change everything everyone thought they knew about Marcus and his relationship with Bob Mackenzie. Dr. Chen, a behavioral veterinarian from the University of Colorado, had driven through the aftermath of the blizzard after hearing about Bob's death and Marcus's vigil from colleagues in the veterinary community. What she carried in that folder would shatter every assumption Tommy and Victoria had made about their father figure and his beloved lion. "I need to show you something," Dr. Chen said, settling into Bob's old kitchen chair while Tommy poured coffee with shaking hands. Victoria sat across from them, her usual corporate composure replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had watched a good man die. "It's about Marcus. About where he really came from before the circus." Tommy looked up sharply. "Dad said Marcus came from a bankrupt circus in Nevada. That's what all the paperwork showed." Dr. Chen opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of medical records stamped with the letterhead of Children's Hospital, Colorado. "The circus story is true, but it's not the whole truth. Marcus lived at that circus for 6 years, yes, but before that he spent 3 years as a therapy animal at our pediatric oncology ward." The coffee cup slipped from Tommy's nerveless fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. "That's impossible. Lions aren't therapy animals. They're wild predators." "Marcus was part of an experimental program," Dr. Chen continued, ignoring the broken ceramic at Tommy's feet. "We were studying whether large predators could be trained to provide emotional support for terminally ill children. The program was controversial and was shut down after an incident, but Marcus was remarkable. He had an almost supernatural ability to sense when children were in distress." Victoria leaned forward, her business mind trying to process this information. "What kind of incident?" Dr. Chen's expression grew troubled. "A malpractice lawsuit. One of our young patients died during a therapy session with Marcus, and the family claimed the stress of interacting with a dangerous animal had hastened their child's death. The program was discontinued immediately, and all the animals were relocated." Tommy felt the world tilting around him. "What was the child's name?" "David Mackenzie." The name hit Tommy like a physical blow. David, his older brother who had died of leukemia at age 12, 3 years before Tommy was born. The brother whose death had cast a shadow over Tommy's entire childhood, the ghost that had stood between him and his father for 35 years. "That's impossible," Tommy whispered. "My brother died in a car accident when I was 2. "Dad always said, 'Your father lied to protect you,'" Dr. Chen said gently. "David died of acute lymphocytic leukemia on March 15, 1993, during what should have been a routine therapy session with Marcus. Bob wasn't a veterinarian then. He was a maintenance worker at the hospital, trying to pay for David's treatment. He'd been watching the therapy sessions for weeks, fascinated by the bond between his son and the lion. The manila folder seemed to grow heavier in Dr. Chen's hands as she continued. According to the medical records, David had been responding well to treatment. His cancer was in remission, and the doctors were optimistic. But during that final session with Marcus, David suddenly went into cardiac arrest. The family sued, claiming that the stress of interacting with a dangerous predator had triggered a fatal arrhythmia. Victoria's face had gone pale, and Bob blamed himself. "Worse than that," Dr. Chen replied. He blamed Marcus. The lawsuit destroyed the therapy program, and all the animals were quietly relocated. Marcus ended up at the circus, where he was treated as just another dangerous beast to be controlled through fear and violence. Bob left Colorado, changed his entire life trajectory, and became a veterinarian, partly, I suspect, as penance for what he believed he'd allowed to happen to his son. Tommy stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see Marcus lying in his enclosure, the lion's injured leg carefully bandaged, but his spirit clearly broken. So, when Marcus came to the sanctuary 3 years ago, Bob didn't recognize him immediately, Dr. Chen confirmed. Lions change significantly as they mature, and Marcus had been badly scarred by his years in the circus, but I believe Marcus recognized Bob. Lions have excellent long-term memory, especially for humans who were present during significant emotional events. The implications crashed over Tommy like a tidal wave. Marcus remembered Dad from the hospital, from the day David died. "And more than that," Dr. Chen said, pulling out another document from the folder. "I've been reviewing the circus veterinary records. Marcus displayed severe behavioral problems for years after leaving the hospital. He refused food, attacked handlers, and showed all the classic signs of what we now recognize as PTSD in large animals. But according to these reports, his behavior began improving dramatically about 6 months before the circus went bankrupt." Victoria frowned. 6 months? That would be right around the time Bob started making inquiries about adopting a lion. Dr. Chen nodded. "I think Marcus somehow knew Bob was looking for him. Animals have senses we don't fully understand, especially when it comes to recognizing people who matter to them. Marcus had been bonded to Bob's family through David, and that bond never broke." Tommy felt his legs give out, and he collapsed back into his chair. Everything he'd believed about his family, his father, and his brother's death had just been revealed as an elaborate fiction designed to protect him from a truth too painful for a 2-year-old to understand. "There's more," Dr. Chen said quietly. The therapy program kept detailed behavioral notes on Marcus. He was trained to recognize the early signs of medical distress in children: changes in breathing, heart rate, body temperature. When a child was approaching a crisis, Marcus would place his paw on their chest and apply gentle, rhythmic pressure. It was remarkably effective at calming anxious patients. Victoria's eyes widened. The night Bob died, Marcus was doing CPR compressions on his chest. "Not CPR," Dr. Chen corrected. "Something much more sophisticated." Marcus was using a technique he'd been trained to perform 15 years ago, trying to calm Bob's cardiac distress the same way he'd been taught to help sick children. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. Tommy tried to process the magnitude of what Dr. Chen was telling them. His father hadn't simply rescued a random circus lion, he'd unknowingly adopted the animal that had been present when his firstborn son died, the creature he'd blamed for that death. "But why didn't Dad recognize Marcus?" Tommy asked. "If he'd watched so many therapy sessions?" "Grief has a way of blocking traumatic memories," Dr. Chen explained. Bob's mind may have protected him from making the connection. Or perhaps on some subconscious level, he did know, and adopting Marcus was his way of seeking forgiveness, from the lion, from David, from himself. Tommy walked back to the window, watching Marcus with new understanding. The lion's unwavering devotion to Bob, his uncanny ability to sense the old man's heart problems, his refusal to leave Bob's side during that final, tragic night. It all made sense now. "The anonymous letters," Victoria said suddenly. "The ones that said, 'He remembers you.' Who was sending those?" Dr. Chen reached into her folder one final time and pulled out a small stack of envelopes, all addressed in the same neat handwriting that Bob had puzzled over for months. Eleanor Patterson. She was a volunteer at the Children's Hospital when David was being treated. She remembered Bob and David, and when she learned about the sanctuary, she started funding it. She also recognized Marcus when she saw him in one of Bob's early reports. "Eleanor Patterson," Victoria repeated slowly. "The name sounds familiar." "She's been your largest anonymous donor," Dr. Chen said. "But more than that, she's been searching for Bob for 25 years. She wanted to tell him the truth about David's death, about Marcus, about the real reason the therapy program was shut down." Tommy felt another shock wave of revelation. "What real reason?" "David didn't die because of his interaction with Marcus," Dr. Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. "The autopsy revealed that he'd been given the wrong dosage of chemotherapy drugs earlier that day. The cardiac arrest was caused by a medication error, not by stress from the therapy session. The hospital covered up the mistake and let the therapy program take the blame." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of Bob's old wall clock and the distant sound of wind through the pine trees. Tommy stared at the medical records spread across the table, trying to absorb the fact that his father had spent 25 years carrying guilt for a death that wasn't his fault, caring for an animal he'd unknowingly blamed for his son's death. "Eleanor Patterson wants to meet with you," Dr. Chen said finally. "She's been hoping to make amends for decades. She has more documents, more truth about what really happened that day." Victoria stood up slowly, her business instincts finally reasserting themselves despite the emotional chaos. "Where is she now?" "Sitting in her car in your driveway," Dr. Chen replied. "She's been there for an hour, working up the courage to knock on the door." Tommy looked toward the front of the cabin, then back at Marcus in his enclosure. 25 years of secrets were about to be laid bare, and he wasn't sure any of them were prepared for the full truth about the extraordinary bonds that had brought them all together. But as he watched Marcus lift his great head to look directly at the cabin, those intelligent amber eyes seeming to peer straight into Tommy's soul, he realized that the lion had been waiting for this moment all along. Marcus had been keeping Bob's secrets, honoring a love that transcended species and tragedy and time itself. Now, it was time for the humans to learn what the lion had always known, that some bonds are stronger than death, and some love stories are too big for any one lifetime to contain. Eleanor Patterson walked up the snow-covered path to Bob's cabin with the measured steps of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for 25 years. At 72, she carried herself with the dignity that comes from a lifetime of wealth and social responsibility, but her hands trembled as she clutched a worn leather portfolio against her chest. Tommy opened the door before she could knock, having watched her approach through the window. Up close, Eleanor was smaller than he'd expected, a petite woman with silver hair and eyes the color of Montana sky, eyes that held decades of carefully contained grief. "Mrs. Patterson," Tommy said softly. "Please, come in." Eleanor stepped into Bob's modest living room, her gaze immediately drawn to the photographs that covered every available surface. Bob with various rescued animals over the years, Bob in his Army uniform during Vietnam, Bob and Helen on their wedding day. But it was the hospital photo that made Eleanor gasp, a faded snapshot of a 12-year-old boy with Tommy's eyes and Bob's stubborn chin, sitting beside a young lion whose amber gaze looked startlingly familiar. "That's David," Tommy said, following her gaze. "I found it in Dad's desk drawer yesterday. He kept it all these years." Eleanor's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reached toward the photograph, then pulled her hand back as if it might burn her. He was such a beautiful boy, so brave. Even when the pain was at its worst, he never complained. He just wanted to spend time with Marcus. Victoria entered from the kitchen carrying a tea service, her corporate efficiency intact despite the emotional chaos of the past few days. She'd spent the morning making phone calls, trying to sort out the legal implications of Bob's death and the sanctuary's future. What she'd discovered had only deepened the mystery surrounding Eleanor Patterson. Mrs. Patterson, Victoria said, setting down the tea tray with deliberate care, I've been reviewing the sanctuary's financial records. You've donated over $2 million in the past 3 years. Why? Eleanor settled into Bob's favorite chair, the leather portfolio still clutched against her chest like armor. Because I owed him that much. Because I failed him when he needed help the most, and I've been trying to make amends ever since. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly observing from the corner, leaned forward. Tell them about the day David died, Eleanor. Tell them what really happened. Eleanor opened the portfolio with shaking fingers, revealing newspaper clippings, medical documents, and legal papers that painted a picture of institutional cover-up and personal tragedy. I was the head nurse in the pediatric oncology ward, she began, her voice steady despite the tears. I was responsible for overseeing the experimental therapy program, including Marcus's sessions with the children. Tommy sat on the edge of the sofa, his psychiatrist's training helping him read the pain in Eleanor's carefully controlled posture. You blame yourself for David's death. I was the one who administered his chemotherapy that morning, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The dosage calculation was my responsibility. Dr. Richards had changed David's medication the day before, but somehow the updated chart never made it to the nursing station. I gave David the old dosage, nearly 3 times what his body could handle. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of Bob's wall clock and the distant sound of wind through the pine trees. Outside, Marcus could be seen lying in his enclosure, his injured leg healing but his spirit still clearly diminished by Bob's absence. By the time we realized what had happened, David was already showing signs of toxic reaction, Eleanor continued. His heart was struggling, his breathing was labored. But he was still conscious, still asking to see Marcus one more time. Dr. Richards said it would be safe, just a few minutes to say goodbye. Victoria found herself holding her breath, understanding now why Eleanor had carried such crushing guilt for so many years. David was lying on the therapy room couch with Marcus beside him, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. The lion knew something was wrong. Animals always do. Marcus was being so gentle, just resting his head on David's chest, listening to his heartbeat the way he'd been trained to do. And David was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. Tommy closed his eyes, trying to imagine his brother, the brother he'd never really known, in those final moments of peace with the magnificent creature who would later become their father's salvation. Then David went into cardiac arrest, Eleanor whispered, right there in Marcus's presence with Bob watching from the observation window. The resuscitation team worked for 40 minutes, but the chemotherapy had damaged his heart too severely. He died, holding on to Marcus's paw. The weight of 25 years of suppressed truth settled over the room like a physical presence. Tommy understood now why his father had lied about David's death, why he'd constructed an elaborate fiction about a car accident rather than tell his younger son about the medical tragedy that had claimed his brother. The hospital administration panicked, Eleanor continued, pulling out a stack of legal documents. A child dying during an experimental therapy session with a wild animal. They knew the liability would be enormous. Dr. Richards pressured me to falsify the medical records. to make it look like David's death was caused by stress from interacting with Marcus rather than the medication error. "And you did it," Victoria said, not accusingly, but with the flat recognition of someone who understood institutional pressure. Eleanor nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I was a single mother with 3 children and no other job prospects. Dr. Richards said if I didn't cooperate, I'd be blamed for the medication error and face criminal charges. I was terrified and weak, and I let them destroy that beautiful therapy program to cover up my mistake." Dr. Chen reached over and placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "The family sued the hospital, not you personally. What happened to that case?" "Bob dropped the lawsuit," Eleanor said, surprising everyone. "After 6 months of depositions and legal battles, he just walked away. His lawyer said he couldn't stand to put David's memory through any more exploitation. The hospital settled quietly for an undisclosed amount. The therapy program was shut down, and all the animals were relocated." Tommy felt a familiar stab of admiration for his father's integrity, even in the depths of grief. Bob had chosen his son's dignity over financial compensation, protecting David's memory even at the cost of justice. "I left the hospital shortly after that," Eleanor continued. "I couldn't stand to work there anymore, knowing what we'd done. I moved to Montana, inherited my husband's cattle ranch, and tried to forget. But I never stopped thinking about Bob and that lion. I hired private investigators to keep track of them both." "That's how you knew Marcus had ended up at the sanctuary," Victoria realized. Eleanor nodded. "When I learned that Bob had unknowingly adopted the same lion who had been present when David died, I knew it was fate, or providence, or maybe just the universe's way of giving me a chance to make things right." She reached into the portfolio one final time and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with wax. "This contains the real medical records from David's death, copies of the falsified documents, and my sworn testimony about what really happened that day. I've been carrying it for 25 years, waiting for the courage to give it to Bob." Tommy took the envelope with trembling hands. "Why didn't you just tell him the truth directly? Why the anonymous donations and cryptic letters?" "Because I was a coward," Eleanor said simply. "I was afraid he'd hate me for my part in covering up the truth. And I was afraid that knowing the real story might hurt him more than help him. But after watching him work with Marcus for 3 years, seeing how much love had grown between them, I realized that the truth might actually bring them both peace." Victoria leaned forward, her business mind working through the implications. "Mrs. Patterson, if these documents prove that David's death was caused by medical malpractice rather than the therapy program, it could change everything. The hospital's insurance would have to pay out a massive settlement, and the reputation of animal-assisted therapy could be restored." Eleanor smiled sadly. "That's partly why I wanted to meet with you. I'm 72 years old, and I don't have any children of my own. My estate is worth approximately $40 million, and I've already changed my will to leave everything to a foundation that will continue Bob's work here at the sanctuary." The magnitude of Eleanor's offer hit them all at once. The sanctuary wouldn't just survive, it could become a model for animal rescue operations across the country. "But there's one condition," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "I want Marcus to be the cornerstone of a new animal-assisted therapy program. I want him to help other children the way he helped David, even if it was only for a few months. I want David's death to mean something positive." Tommy looked out the window at Marcus, who seemed to sense he was being discussed. The lion lifted his great head and looked directly at the cabin, those intelligent amber eyes holding depths of understanding that still amazed everyone who met him. "Marcus is getting older," Tommy said carefully. "He's been through tremendous trauma, both at the circus and now with Dad's death. I'm not sure he'd be suitable for therapy work." "That's where you're wrong," Dr. Chen interjected. "I've been observing Marcus since I arrived, and his behavior suggests he's actually seeking purpose. Therapy animals who lose their handlers often become depressed, unless they're given new work to do. Marcus needs children to care for. It's what he was trained to do, what he was born to do. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out one final photograph, a color picture of Marcus as a young lion, sitting calmly beside a group of children in hospital gowns, all of them smiling despite their obvious illness. "This was taken 2 weeks before David died," Eleanor said. "Look at Marcus's face. Look how content he is, how purposeful. This is what he's meant to do with his life. Bob saved him from the circus, but now Marcus can save other children from the fear and loneliness that come with serious illness." Tommy studied the photograph, seeing not just a trained animal, but a creature who had found his calling in comforting the most vulnerable members of society. Maybe this was what his father had been working toward all along without realizing it. Not just rescuing broken animals, but preparing them to heal broken hearts. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I never told anyone, not even the investigators." She paused, gathering courage for one final revelation. David's last words weren't about wanting to see his family or asking about heaven. He looked up at Marcus and said, "Take care of my dad, okay? He's going to need a friend." And Marcus actually nodded. "I swear to you, that lion understood what David was asking him to do." The room fell silent as the full circle of love and loss and redemption finally completed itself. David had died asking Marcus to care for his father. Marcus had spent 3 years doing exactly that. And now, with Bob gone, Marcus needed a new purpose that would honor both the boy who had loved him and the man who had saved him. Tommy looked at Victoria, then at Eleanor, then back out the window at Marcus. In his years as a psychiatrist, he'd learned that healing often came in unexpected forms. Maybe it was time to trust that an old lion's capacity for love was bigger than any of them had dared to imagine. "All right," Tommy said quietly. "Let's bring Marcus home." Sometimes the most profound love stories aren't between people. They're between broken souls who find each other across impossible odds. Bob Mackenzie thought he was saving a damaged circus lion, but Marcus was actually completing a promise made by a dying 12-year-old boy 25 years earlier. "Take care of my dad," David had whispered to Marcus in his final moments. And that magnificent lion spent the rest of his life doing exactly that. This story reminds us that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, finding new ways to express itself through the most unexpected messengers. Bob carried guilt for decades over his son's death, never knowing that the very creature he blamed had become his guardian angel. Marcus recognized Bob instantly, not as the maintenance worker from a hospital, but as the father of the boy who had loved him completely. In our golden years, we often wonder if our lives have mattered, if the love we've given will somehow continue after we're gone. Bob's story proves that every act of kindness, every moment of compassion creates ripples that can span decades and even species. The sanctuary Bob built with love became a testament to the eternal nature of true devotion. What unexpected messenger has brought healing into your life? Have you ever experienced a connection that seemed to transcend ordinary understanding? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.